When Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels dropped in the late 90s, nobody thought it would shake things up, but it did. It turned a small, gritty film into a cult classic, and behind it are some strange stories and odd facts that make it even more fun to look back on. In this video, I'll take you through all this. Number 20. Jason Statham's real-life dad was a street hustler. 2. Jason Statham as Bacon in Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels feels like one of those roles where you almost think the man was born to play it because he fits so naturally into the whole street hustler world. And the funny truth behind it is that he really did grow up around that kind of life. His father was a hustler too, not in the big-time way, not in suits and fancy deals, but on the streets, moving things here and there, knowing how to charm people into buying stuff that was not worth half of what he said it was. So Jason grew up with those rhythms, hearing how quickly words could make money and watching how body language could close a deal. All that became part of him before he dreamed of standing before a camera. When Guy Ritchie cast him, he was not some trained actor from a drama school. He was literally a man selling fake jewelry and perfume on the street corners, and the role of Bacon was almost like a reflection of what he had been doing anyway. Number 19. A random Bollywood poster pops up. Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels is remembered for its gritty London look, the pubs, alleys, and warehouses that gave it a raw charm. But hidden in there is something that most people miss until maybe the second or third viewing, a poster on the wall for an Indian film called Pardes. It is not a joke, it is not a clue, and it is not even something the director planted with intention. It is just part of the background, because they were filming in East London, where South Asian communities had been building their lives and their culture for decades. The walls in those neighborhoods were covered in posters, from movies to concerts to community events, and the Pardes poster happened to be there when the crew rolled their cameras. That tiny accident added something tangible to the film, reminding viewers that London was not just the gangster underworld you see in the plot, it was also full of immigrants and families and other cultures living side by side. The poster does nothing to move the story forward, but it makes the setting feel alive, like the camera had captured the city as it truly was. You get Eddie and Bacon and Soap in the foreground, and in the background, you get a glimpse of London's diversity, and that mix is part of what makes the film so authentic, even when it was never planned that way. Number 18. The actors stayed friends for real. There is something about how the four main lads in Lock, Stock, Eddie, Soap, Tom, and Bacon, hang around each other that feels too natural to be just a script, and the reason is simple. The actors who played them became friends while shooting, and that friendship did not stop when filming ended. They carried it outside the movie, into real life, into years after the premiere, making what we see on screen even more believable. You can sense that bond in the film because the banter and arguments do not sound stiff. They sound like what mates really say when they know each other well. A director can tell actors to act close, but you cannot fake trust, and that trust was there because they were genuinely having fun together. As the film blew up and they all found themselves in the spotlight, that shared experience locked them together even more. They had gone from unknowns to recognizable faces almost overnight, and done it side by side. That kind of ride is hard to understand unless you live it, and the fact that they lived it together kept the friendship alive. Watching the film now, you are not just watching characters, you are watching the start of genuine relationships long after the credits roll. Number 17. The budget was tiny, but everyone pushed through. Looking back at Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels today, it feels like this big, stylish British classic with a cool edge. Still, the truth is that the money behind it at the start was almost nothing compared to what films usually get. It was a shoestring budget that Guy Ritchie had to stretch in every way possible. And the crazy part is that somehow that lack of money forced everyone to be more creative than they might have been if they had cash to throw around. The crew did not have the luxury of giant sets or endless takes. They had to use real locations, real bars, and real flats. And they had to move fast because renting space or blocking streets in London cost money they simply did not have. Instead of building a world, they captured one already there, which is why the film looks so raw and honest. Even the costumes were not designed from scratch, but came from second-hand shops, or were pieces the actors already owned, and you can see that lived in quality in the way everyone looks on screen. It does not feel polished, because it was not, and that grit was part of the charm. The actors were not being paid big money either, and some were unknown at the time, which meant they were hungry. They were giving it everything because they knew this might be their one shot to break into the industry. That mix of no budget and big hunger created an energy you cannot fake. Number 16. Sting almost stole the spotlight. One of the most surprising names in the cast list is Sting, the rock star Sting, who shows up in the film playing JD, Eddie's father, and even though his screen time is not massive, his presence left a strong mark. He was already a huge global celebrity, and Guy Ritchie's casting him was a bit of a shock because people wondered if he was just there as a gimmick. But Sting ended up perfect in the role because he brought this cool, weathered, almost fatherly calm into a story full of chaos and noise. The funny thing is that Sting was not chasing an acting career. He was already successful with music, he had nothing to prove, so he could just relax into the role. That gave JD a believable weight, like this was a man who had seen a lot in life and was not easily impressed or shaken. The scenes with him and Nick Moran, who plays Eddie, feel grounded because Sting did not act like a superstar, he acted like a father, and that balance helped keep the film steady when it could have tipped into cartoonish energy. There were stories at the time about how some of the younger cast felt nervous acting opposite him, not because he was aggressive but simply because he was Sting, the guy from The Police, the global name. Yet he blended in so smoothly that by the time the cameras rolled, it felt like he had always belonged in that smoky London world. It is weird when you think about it now because people still debate whether his cameo boosted the movie's popularity or distracted from it. Still, either way, his appearance became one of those fun details that people always bring up when they talk about Lock, Stock. Number 15. The dialogue was rewritten right on the spot. One of Lock, Stock's big secrets is that much of the dialogue was not locked into the script as expected. Guy Ritchie had a clear story and structure, but when the actors showed up and started rehearsing lines, sometimes they just did not sound right. Instead of forcing them to stick to the page, he let them bend it, change words, and add flavor. In some cases, whole bits of dialogue were rewritten on the spot to make it flow more naturally. This gave the movie that quick and snappy rhythm that people loved. It sounded like real people talking, unlike actors reading from a page. With his hustler background, Jason Statham was especially good at throwing in phrases and expressions that felt authentic, because he had used lines like that in real life when trying to sell cheap goods on the street. Nick Moran also had moments where he reshaped his lines so that Eddie sounded more like himself rather than a character written by someone else. That looseness made the banter between the four main guys feel alive. The arguments, jokes, and swearing carried a rhythm from authentic voices, not stiff rehearsals. Sometimes Guy Ritchie would even encourage them to run the scene more than once in slightly different ways, and he would keep the version that felt the most natural. That is why watching it feels like overhearing a conversation rather than watching a performance. It was risky because rewriting on the spot can backfire, but in this case, it worked perfectly. Number 14. The poker scene was almost too real. The big poker game that sets off the whole story is the beating heart of the film, because without that game, nothing else would happen. And here is the strange part. The scene was shot in such a way that it almost looked more like a real gambling night than a staged movie set. Guy Ritchie wanted authenticity, so instead of scripting every card move, he let the actors play cards for real in between takes. Of course, they were not playing for vast sums, but the rhythm, bluffs, laughter, and tired eyes were all real after sitting for hours at the table. Some crew members said that by the time the cameras were rolling, the actors had gotten so into the game's mood that they forgot where the acting stopped and real tension began. Jason Fleming, who played Tom, later admitted that there were moments he completely lost track of whether he was in character or just himself trying not to lose face during the bluff. Number 13. The guns were real. At one point. This one should not have happened in a professional film set, but in the late 90s, safety rules were not as heavily enforced as they are now. The iconic antique shotguns, the two smoking barrels the title talks about, were not just replicas for every scene. At some point during filming, they actually had real functioning guns on set, and that gave some of the cast a bit of uneasiness because no one wanted to pull the wrong trigger accidentally. It is said that for certain close-up shots, Guy Ritchie insisted on using actual old shotguns to capture the detail of the engravings and the weight they carried in the characters' hands, since replicas did not give that same look. Vinnie Jones later joked that he was more nervous holding that antique gun than he was playing professional football because, at least on the pitch, the worst that could happen was a broken leg. Still, here it felt like he was holding something that could explode in his face if mishandled. Eventually, production leaned more toward replicas for safety reasons. Still, the fact that some real weapons were handled during the filming adds to the strange aura around the movie, as if the danger on screen was never too far from danger in reality. Number 12. The cast got paid. Almost nothing. At first, looking back today, it feels unbelievable, but when Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels was made, it was not backed by a big studio throwing millions of pounds around. It was Guy Ritchie's first feature film, and nobody knew if it would work, so the budget was painfully tight. Many actors, including Jason Statham, who became a massive action star, got paid next to nothing for their work. We are talking about small flat fees that barely covered expenses, and in some cases favors were called in just to keep things going. Statham was basically plucked off the street, where he had been selling knockoff perfume and jewelry, so when he was offered a small paycheck to appear in the film, it still felt like a step up from hustling on corners. Vinnie Jones did the movie while still transitioning from football, so he was not expecting Hollywood money either. But the strange twist is that this lack of money somehow added to the energy of the project, because everyone on set knew they were not there for the paycheck. They were there because the script was sharp, and the chance to be part of something raw and new was too good to pass up. Later, when the movie blew up and became a cult success, the actors could laugh about how little they were initially paid compared to how much their careers skyrocketed afterward. But at the time, it was less funny and more of a desperate hustle to ensure the film finished production. Number 11. The film was nearly stopped by censors. In 1998. When the movie was finally ready to be released in 1998, there was a big fear that it might not even make it to British cinemas because of the censorship board. The British Board of Film Classification, which had a reputation for being very strict back in those days about films that showed violence mixed with humor, looked at Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels and almost demanded that whole chunks of the movie be cut. They thought the way it showed fistfights, shootings, drug deals, swearing, and then wrapped it all in black comedy would send the wrong message to younger audiences who might copy the style. It is worth remembering that this was a different decade, and even a few years earlier, Quentin Tarantino's Reservoir Dogs from 1992 had gotten a lot of heat in the United Kingdom for being too violent. There were reports around the summer of 1998 that the board nearly banned the film, which would have killed it before anyone saw it, but Guy Ritchie and producer Matthew Vaughn fought back. They told the censors that the story was meant to be ironic, that it was not glorifying gangsters but making fun of them, and after weeks of tense discussions, the film was allowed through with an 18 certificate. It finally premiered in Britain in the late summer of 1998, and quickly made noise as one of the boldest crime movies ever coming out of the country. Without that fight, the whole project could have stayed buried, and stars like Jason Statham or Vinnie Jones might never have gotten their first shot at a real acting career. Number 10. Sting was cast as Eddie's dad by pure luck. One of the strangest facts about the casting is that Sting, the famous singer from The Police, ended up playing Eddie's father, and it was not planned in some grand way. Guy Ritchie and Matthew Vaughn did not exactly have a lot of money to throw around for stars, since this was a small-budget film, so getting Sting into it sounds wild now, but it happened almost by accident. Vaughn was well connected socially in London, and had known Sting personally through friends, and so when the idea came up that Eddie's dad should be someone with a strong presence, they asked Sting if he wanted to do it. By then, Sting had already appeared in a handful of films, like Dune in 1984 and The Bride in 1985, though he was not focused on acting full-time. He agreed to take the part for fun, playing a protective dad who runs a bar and gets caught up in the edges of Eddie's mess. Even though Sting had only a few minutes of screen time, fans remembered him instantly, and his presence gave the film a little extra edge, because suddenly here was this world-famous musician turning up in a gritty crime comedy. People who went to see the movie in 1998 were surprised when they saw him, and even now that cameo is one of the talking points. It also helped give the film more publicity, because newspapers at the time covered how Sting showed up in this low-budget British gangster flick. Number 9. Jason Flemyng landed, his role through an old friendship. Jason Flemyng, who played Tom, was another casting story that felt like it was born out of luck, timing, and friendships rather than big Hollywood deals. Flemyng had already worked as an actor in the early 90s, with minor roles in British television and films, and he trained at the London Academy of Music and Dramatic Art. He had also been part of the Royal Shakespeare Company for a while, so he was no stranger to proper acting, but he was not yet a household name. Around 1997, he crossed paths with Guy Ritchie and Matthew Vaughn through the London scene. Because Guy was putting together a cast of sharp, believable London lads rather than polished movie stars, Jason Flemyng felt like the perfect fit. His character, Tom, was the smooth talker of the group, the one always trying to wriggle out of trouble with words instead of fists, and it fit Jason's personality and charm. The friendship angle was real because he and some other cast members knew each other before the film, making the group chemistry more authentic on screen. Fleming's performance in the movie ended up being one of his breakouts, leading him later into bigger projects like Snatch in the year 2000 and even Hollywood movies in the early 2000s. Number 8. The budget was tiny compared to what the film earned. One thing about Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels is how little money they had to make it and how much it eventually earned. The budget was only about £1.5 million, which in film is next to nothing, especially when you think of Hollywood movies in the late 1990s that cost $50 or even $100 million. Guy Ritchie and Matthew Vaughn had to scrape everything together, using favors, pulling in friends, and cutting corners to stretch every pound. They borrowed locations instead of building sets, used unknown actors or brand new ones instead of expensive stars, and sometimes had to do scenes in just 1 or 2 takes because film stock was expensive and they could not afford to waste it. The cast and crew often joked that it felt like they were shooting some long student project rather than a real feature, but they pushed through with the belief that the story and the style would carry it. Here is the shocking part. The film came out in the United Kingdom in 1998. Then later in the United States in early 1999, it made over $28 million worldwide. That means the film multiplied its tiny budget more than 20 times, which is insane for a British gangster comedy made by a first-time director. Critics and fans were stunned by how slick it looked, considering how little money they had. Number 7. Vinnie Jones shocked everyone with his acting. Vinnie Jones was already a well-known name in Britain before this movie. Still, not in the film world, he was famous for being one of the toughest footballers in English soccer during the 1980s and early 1990s. He played for teams like Wimbledon, Leeds United, and Chelsea, and his reputation was built on rough tackles, loud shouting, and being the guy that other players feared on the pitch. Nobody ever thought or saw him as an actor, so when Guy Ritchie cast him as Big Chris, people were confused and even laughed at the idea, thinking it wouldn't work. But then the cameras rolled, and Vinnie surprised everybody. His natural presence, a mix of intimidation and humor, worked perfectly for the role of a debt collector with a strange sense of loyalty. His scenes, especially the ones with his on-screen son, Little Chris, became some of the most memorable in the film. Critics praised his performance, saying a man with no formal acting training stole the show from professionals. The movie opened in 1998, and by the time the reviews came out, newspapers were already writing headlines about how the ex-football hardman had reinvented himself. This success gave Vinnie Jones a new career entirely, and in the following years, he appeared in Hollywood films like Gone in 60 Seconds in the year 2000 and X-Men: The Last Stand in 2006. Number 6. The editing style changed British cinema. In the 90s, one of the things that made the film so special was its editing style. It was flashy, fast, and energetic, something not familiar in British films before that. Guy Ritchie and his editor Niven Howie cut the film with quick jump cuts, freeze frames, and overlapping dialogue, which gave it a rhythm that felt closer to a music video than a traditional crime movie. This made sense because the 1990s were also the era when music videos on MTV had become hugely influential, shaping how younger audiences expected entertainment to look and feel. Ritchie borrowed from that style and used it in a gangster story, which was unusual but refreshing. The editing did more than just make the film look stylish. It also helped cover up the budget limitations. Cutting fast and using clever transitions could make small sets look bigger, and action scenes look more expensive. When the movie was released in Britain in 1998, critics pointed out how modern it felt, saying it looked like something new even though it was built out of old gangster movie cliches. Other filmmakers quickly picked up on the style, and within a few years, you could see echoes of it in other British crime films and even in Hollywood. Number 5. Jason Statham was selling jewelry on the street before he got the part. Before Jason Statham became well known by people as the big action star that everyone knows from movies like The Transporter and Fast and Furious, he was just another London guy hustling to get by. And one of the ways he made money in the mid-1990s was by selling fake jewelry and perfume on the streets. He would set up in market areas and use his charm to convince people to buy watches or chains that looked expensive but were not really worth much. This was not just some side detail. This little hustle got him noticed. Matthew Vaughn, who was producing Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels, saw Jason doing his street sales routine one day and thought the guy had charisma, the kind of personality that could light up a camera. Jason was introduced to Guy Ritchie, and instead of doing a regular audition, he just showed them how he hustled on the street, talked fast, and carried himself, and they loved it. That is how he ended up being cast as Bacon in the film, one of the lead characters in a group of 4 friends. The role fit perfectly, because Bacon was quick-talking, cheeky, and a bit of a trickster, which was just Jason being himself. The film came out in 1998 and gave him his very first movie credit, which then snowballed into more roles, and within just a few years, he was starring in Snatch in the year 2000, and then The Transporter in 2002. Number 4. The film was originally meant to be much darker. Guy Ritchie had a vision for Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels that was even darker than what audiences saw. In the script's early drafts, written around 1995 and 1996, the story had less comedy and more violent grit. Characters that survived in the final film were initially supposed to die, and there were endings where almost everyone lost, including Eddie and his friends. The idea was to make a pure gangster tragedy, but along the way, Guy realized that mixing humor with the crime story made it more unique and entertaining. By the time filming started in 1997, the script had been rewritten multiple times to balance the dark with the funny, and you can still see the shadows of the original darker version in certain scenes. For example, the way the debt to Hatchet Harry is introduced, or the brutal beatings in the side plots, feel harsher than the light tone of the narration. People close to the production later said that if Guy had gone with his first vision, the movie might never have broken out of the United Kingdom because it would have been too bleak and depressing. Number 3. The film helped launch Matthew Vaughn as a major producer. When people talk about Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels, they mostly talk about Guy Ritchie and how it was his breakout, but another big story hiding behind it is how it also launched Matthew Vaughn, who was only in his mid-20s when he produced it. Vaughn came from a wealthy background and had some connections in the film industry, but he was still very young and had not produced a major film before. Taking on a risky, low-budget gangster comedy by a first-time director was not the obvious choice, but Vaughn believed in Ritchie's script and style. He helped raise the money, manage the budget, and used his social network to get people like Sting to appear in the film. Without Vaughn, the movie might never have even been finished, because he was the one who kept the production moving when money was tight. After the film became a success in 1998, his reputation skyrocketed, and he went on to produce Snatch in the year 2000, further cementing his name in the industry. Later, Vaughn moved into directing himself, making films like Layer Cake in 2004 which launched Daniel Craig toward James Bond, and eventually big Hollywood projects like X-Men First Class in 2011 and the Kingsman series starting in 2014. Number 2. The ending rarely happened, the way we saw it. The ending of Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels is one of the reasons people kept talking about it. That final scene where the lads are standing around with the antique shotguns trying to figure out what to do. Eddie is on the phone with his dad, and the film just cuts off, leaving us hanging. What most fans do not know is that this ending was not the original plan at all. In Guy Ritchie's first drafts, which he had been working on since around 1995, the story wrapped up more completely, with certain characters facing justice and the guns being taken away by the law. But when they shot it in 1997 and screened it for test audiences, people felt it dragged too much, tied things up too neatly, and lost energy. Guy then changed it, adding the sudden cut ending, which left viewers in 1998 buzzing because nobody knew what happened next. Did they throw the guns away, keep them, or did the police find out? Nobody could be sure. That open-ended finish turned into one of the most significant talking points in reviews, with critics saying it gave the film a cool, modern edge, almost like European art house cinema, but set in the East End of London. The crazy part is that this decision was made very late, almost at the last stage of editing, which shows how thin the line was between an ordinary movie and an unforgettable one. If the original tidy ending had stayed, the film might not have stuck in people's minds the same way, and the cult following might never have grown. Number 1. It turned Guy Ritchie into a star overnight. The single most important fact about Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels is that it turned Guy Ritchie from a nobody into one of the most famous directors of the late 1990s and early 2000s almost overnight. Before this film, Ritchie had only done some music videos and one short film called The Hard Case in 1995, which was basically a practice run for Lock, Stock. He struggled to get noticed, and no big studios wanted to take a chance on him. The reaction was huge when the film emerged in Britain in August of 1998. Critics compared him to Quentin Tarantino, audiences loved the style and humor, and suddenly he was being called the new voice of British cinema. Within a year, in 1999, the movie was being released internationally. By the year 2000, he was directing Snatch, which had stars like Brad Pitt and Benicio del Toro, something unthinkable just a few years earlier. By the mid-2000 years, he was directing big projects in Hollywood, and later he even got to reboot Sherlock Holmes with Robert Downey Jr. in 2009. It all traces back to that small, scrappy film shot in 1997 and released in 1998, a film that carried the energy of a backroom bet and the grit of London's underbelly. Its budget was smaller than some television commercials at the time, yet it had the impact of a full-fledged blockbuster. Nobody expected it to make the kind of noise it did. It wasn't polished in the traditional Hollywood sense, but that was the point. It was raw, loud, stylish, and unapologetically British. The strangest part is that none of its success was guaranteed. For every independent crime drama, dozens never made it past cult status, often forgotten within a year or two. If Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels had stumbled at the box office, Guy Ritchie might have slipped quietly into obscurity, remembered only by a handful of critics as that director who almost made it. But fate had other plans. Instead, the film exploded, shaking up audiences and the industry with its razor-sharp dialogue, breakneck editing, and ensemble cast that seemed plucked straight from the streets. It gave Jason Statham and Vinnie Jones their big breaks, turning them into household names. More importantly, it cemented Guy Ritchie as a fresh new voice in modern cinema, one who could bend genres, elevate street slang into poetry, and make low-budget filmmaking feel like an adrenaline rush. Decades later, people still talk about that debut like lightning caught in a bottle. Critics point to how it redefined the gangster film for a new generation, stripping away the American gloss and replacing it with British grit and wit. Fans remember the unforgettable one-liners, the chaotic energy of its pacing, and the sense that they were watching something bold, new, and slightly dangerous. It wasn't just a movie but a cultural moment that announced Ritchie's arrival spectacularly. Looking back, it feels almost mythic. That single film opened doors to a career that would span decades, with Ritchie moving from the alleys of East London to the glitz of Hollywood blockbusters. But for many, no matter how far he's gone since, Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels remains the purest expression of his style, scrappy, stylish, and unforgettable. What do you think about this documentary? Kindly share your thoughts in the comments, then take a moment to like, share, and turn on the notification to be notified whenever we make a new video.